Welcome back. We're talking about Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Africa and the United Arab Emirates. Let's get back to our panel. Abdullahi, let me start with you this time. The former US President Barack Obama was recently in South Africa. He made a speech there. He talked about the continent's future, its development. Let's take a listen to part of what he had to say.
And as we pursue, for example, sustainable development goals, we have to get past the charity mindset. We've got to bring more resources to the forgotten pockets of the world through investment and entrepreneurship, because there is talent everywhere in the world if given an opportunity.
That model that President Obama is talking about there, Africa doesn't want to be a basket case that's a recipient of charity. That is a model that is being pursued by China, isn't it?
In some ways. The reality is, like I mentioned in the previous segment, Africa is not a problem. For quite some time, since independence in the 60s, Africa was looked at as a problem that needs to be solved. During that time, there were so many missed opportunities. But Africa is not like that. I mean, if you look around, the level of, forward leap that most of these countries are making, whether it's in data, whether it's in space, whether it's talent management, whether it's, tech, using tech for so many things, including health, education. It's on a very small scale. It needs now to be picked up. But Africans also need to begin, gaining the confidence not to charter its own future. A lot of the time, yes, even here, the discussion is largely about China or the West. It's not just that. For Africa, this is a multiple opportunities where the unipolar world after the Second World War is facing tremendous, strain. It's an opportunity for Africa to diversify. If the Chinese are bringing in the hardware, roads, railways, large-scale infrastructure projects, the West also has the software where, whether it's tech, whether it's, long-distance medicine, telemedicine, that is. So I think for Africa, it's not a question of them choosing the East or the West for me. It's rather Africa looking at it based on case by case and saying, this is good for Africa, let's pursue it. This is not great, we have another alternative, without necessarily creating any tension. And that is where, my brother's point about, the softer areas of integration around books, culture, and art, and UAE, Qataris, they're all around in Africa now. Particularly, look at a small nation of Djibouti now, where all these countries, because of its access to sea, have not only military bases, but are also looking at it as an access to sea. And that is where the China Belt and Road Initiative all converges. For me, the point the president made about entrepreneurship is helpful, but also I should, caution us against, outsourcing some of these things to just entrepreneurs. Because if all these things, amazing things that are going on in Africa, are not anchored in sustainable institutional development, institutional enhancement, if the parliament are not great, if, judiciary is not doing its job well, if, civil political administration is not doing its job, we might not get the optimum outcome of this.
Right. Edmund, is that the experience in the Middle East as well? I mean, you talked about diversification. At one time, Middle Eastern countries were seen as simply a source of energy, oil and gas. It was one-way traffic. But now, how big is the two-way traffic between the Middle East and China?
There's no doubt that this is growing. In the beginning, it was mostly energy. China needed energy since around 93. China could no longer supply all of the energy that it needs. So they began to look outside as the economy was growing. So that's why they began to look in other areas, whether it's in the Middle East, the Gulf, or Africa, or other regions. But now there is a need on both sides to diversify. And that's what we are beginning to see. This sustainable development that we just heard about is extremely important because it serves the interests of both sides. In addition to this, what we are seeing in the areas of construction, for example, China plays a very important role. And interestingly enough, recently there was a report that China now is ahead of the US in selling weapons and arms, helping security in the African countries, which is quite interesting because this is significant, indicative of something else. This is that the interest now is going beyond energy. It's going beyond oil, that there are geopolitical interests as well. And this is why we saw in the past China was cautious, somewhat cautious, than the conflicts that the Gulf region is witnessing, whether it's between Iran and the Arab Gulf states. But now, at the same time, it seems that China wants to play a bigger role as it is emerging, not only as a major economic power, but it's beginning to emerge also as a superpower. And that's where economics, culture, trade, and one last point I would like to mention that's very significant. In the Middle East, people have a long history of China. I mean, the Chinese trade with China goes almost 2,000 years ago. And in the 7th century, with the rise of Islam, there was also increasing trade. At one time, in the UAE, the ports had 50 Chinese ships, some of the ports in the Northern Emirates of what's today the UAE. That's amazing. So people remember that, and there is something, a saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, which says, seek learning, even if you have to go all the way to China. And so that's something, because of the distance at that time. China was almost at the end of the world.
Chen Chenchen, how important is it for President Xi to see these developments, to see these visits, these projects that they're talking about, actually extend to the African people? That diplomacy is not confined just to leaders. I mean, he did something before he went to these African countries. He wrote a letter which was published in each of the nations that he will be visiting. To what extent was that an attempt to connect directly with the African people?
Well, Anand, you touched upon a very critical issue. Actually, if you read the lines of all those letters, you see he frequently mentions the Belt and Road Initiative, which is supposed to be the biggest framework under which China and African countries are cooperating. Well, if you look at the priorities of this framework, you can see that Belt and Road Initiative is taking, at least at the current stage, is taking a top-down approach. It means the government-to-government level, you have the connection of the strategic plans, the development plans first, and then you take the critical and concrete actions in the specific projects. But a problem is that currently, especially in the infrastructure construction, it is the state-owned enterprises or SOEs which are conducting most of the job, at least at this stage. So it is quite important that both sides are quite clearly aware that if you want to make Belt and Road Initiative sustainable, feasible in the future, in the longer run, you have to include social capital. You have to stimulate social vigor. I think that is the very clear message that Xi's letters are delivering. He's trying to approach to not just the general public, but more specifically the social capital in all these countries, because we can clearly see that the Belt and Road Initiative is not mobilizing enough social capital, not just in China, but also in those local countries. And the leaderships are clearly aware of that. I think that's a critical message.
Alexander, let's talk about the next BRICS summit that will be taking place in South Africa, in Johannesburg, at the end of this week. It comes at a time when, as Abdullahi pointed out earlier on, there are changes in the world. The world is changing. The United States has now adopted a position of America first. We have this escalating trade dispute between China and the United States, which is no doubt going to impact the rest of the world. So how important are these multilateral forums like BRICS in this climate?
Specifically for China, these forums are critical because China needs an open environment, an open multilateral system that supports trade. And not a closed system, and therefore China keeps working for an open international system, even under UN system or BRICS. So therefore, I think the BRICS summit, the forthcoming in South Africa, will be crucial also to create a unified position between the BRICS countries, also to show America that the open system can be functional. But at the same time, for China, it's not only the BRICS, but we need to be clear also with BRICS, because BRICS, India, China have different ideas about the BRI, for example. So it's not a coherent system, but at the same time, it can be used to showcase to the outside world that these countries are capable of reacting to unilateral moves coming from the US or other countries in the world. This is the one thing. The next aspect would be also to strengthen the New Development Bank, to give it more leeway to help these countries to help each other in keeping the international trade open. In this regard, in my opinion, the visit to the UAE also plays a crucial role. We need to understand that Dubai and Abu Dhabi, the two places, play an important role for China, especially towards trade towards Africa. 60% of China's export is being traded or being handled in those two ports towards Africa, but also towards the region. So this country has a very, very crucial role for China, and strengthening those relationships is actually is positive for China. So I think China is doing a smart move again by courting UAE, but also to spread along in African countries, in Senegal especially, but also in South Africa. So we will see more happening in the coming weeks, yes.
Okay, and that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CGTN America. Or visit us on Facebook. That's facebook.com/CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.